so much to all of you for being here. I'm super excited about the day. It's a wonderful chance for me to spend some time with lots of folks whose scholarly work I really admire and don't get enough time to spend exchanging ideas with. So I'm going to introduce Rob Nixon, who's the author of Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor. And last night we were chatting at the dinner and talking about introductions in another context, and Rob said, please don't make a big deal tomorrow. So I'm not going to make a big deal with the introduction, but of course, Rob is the Rachel Carson Professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his book has been really important for me and for lots of us around the law school that have read it. But it started because our colleague Sue Drummond left a copy on my desk and said, can you review this book for the Osgoode Hall Law Journal? And then a little while after that, my friend and colleague Ruth Buchanan wrote to me and said her friend Sandhya and her thought maybe we should read this book. Have you heard of this book? And I said, well, I've already reviewed this book. I did it for the Osgoode Hall Law Journal. So things started coming together. And the interesting piece is that when I wrote to Rob, you always feel this bit of intimidation, and people have a big web presence. Rob has a big web presence and an impressive bio, and I thought, well, I'll just try and write him a note anyway, right? And so it's like, Dear Professor Nixon, I really enjoyed your book. I wrote a review, it's attached, and maybe you might be interested in it. And the best thing I can say about Rob is what I got back was an extremely warm and generous note that was long and engaged with the ideas that I had written about in a serious way, and I just was so impressed with that. And since then we've encountered a person who's really genuinely interested in the scholarly exchange of ideas in an interdisciplinary spirit, and so it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Rob Nixon to Osgoode and to have all of you here to join our conversations today. Rob.
Well, thanks so much, Dayna. First of all, thanks for welcoming a methodological stranger into your midst. This is the furthest out I've been. I don't mean with... I know you've heard that before probably at York. But I just mean simply, I was delighted when Dayna sent me what's more than a review, really a very wide-ranging essay that not only got what I was trying to do in the book, but extended my thinking in ways that I hadn't considered. And I found that invaluable, particularly her exploratory remarks about the possible ramifications for legal studies. So thanks to Dayna and to Ruth Buchanan and Sonia Lawrence and Pooja Parmar and Natalia Engelt for all the work. I know just how much work goes into putting something like this together. I wanted to, partly inspired by the blog, which I've really been enjoying, so thanks for keeping that moving. I wanted to start with an epigraph. Okay, so partly inspired by Doug's compendious, wonderful response, I thought I'd start with a historical quote. And it's from the great poet of the enclosures in Britain, John Clare. And Clare wrote, "Enclosure came and trampled on the grave of labor's rights and left the poor a slave. And birds and trees and flowers without a name all sighed when lawless laws enclosure came." So most of my book is focused on what's sometimes called the new enclosures, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, associated with neoliberalism. But I wanted to reference at least the old enclosures that Doug talked about in greater detail. And a couple of things I think are resonant in this excerpt from John Clare. First of all, the question of the paradox of lawless law, and this is something that Dayna engaged with in her writing about slow violence. The situations where law is an agent of violence and the situations where law can mitigate violence, and both preemptively or in terms of redress and compensation. In addition, one of the things you have here is not a universal human subject, but a focus on the most vulnerable. In this case, the rights of laborers and the poor who are enslaved by the throttling movement of enclosure. And from an environmental perspective, what's also interesting here is Claire's attention both to the vulnerable human and the non-human, the other life forms, that double vulnerability. Very often we veer off into environmental justice streams and animal rights streams and so forth. But here you have the sense of the entangled vulnerabilities of the poor and of the birds and the trees and the flowers without a name. So there's this focus on anonymity as associated with vulnerability or compounding vulnerability. And very much what I was trying to talk to in my book was what are the strategies for redressing that anonymity in terms of voice, in terms of form, in terms of rendering the anonymous visible. So the focus of my book is really threefold. First, rethinking violence, rethinking the standard conceptions of violence. Secondly, paying attention to the proliferating social movements in the global south that have arisen largely in response to the incremental violence of neoliberalism. And thirdly, looking at the process of translation. And this is something that also came up in the blog, the go-between, the figure who are sometimes not from a social movement, but play a critical and complex mediating role between that movement and a broader public awareness. But my first move was really to attend to come at violence from a different angle. And the typical view of violence is one of sensation and drama and immediacy, of exploding into spectacle. And certainly, particularly in the States perhaps, since 9/11 that has been redoubled, a narrowing of what constitutes violence. And I think even if we look at the incredibly infinitely postponed response to climate change in the US, I think 9/11 has had something to do with that. The idea of what constitutes an emergency is dramatic and immediate as opposed to the emergencies of the long term. So that's, I'm trying to think of this in imaginative terms and in strategic terms. In other words, in terms of the difference between something like the Deep Horizon explosion and the ongoing percolations of Corexit in the waters of the Gulf and in the chain of life within the Gulf. And so those are two very different kinds of seeing and two very different kinds of narrating that are involved there. We could contrast it, for instance, to an issue like, if we contrast the environmental issue with an issue like gun control, where you have scenes of carnage, you have bodies, you have momentary slaughter, and there is a visceral element that attaches to those scenes over and over again in the US. Whereas for most of the environmental struggles that we're talking about, the question of visibility and culpability is much more convoluted. So you have these convoluted chains of events and blame, whether we're talking about climate change, toxic drift, biomagnification, the thawing cryosphere, or the nitrates that get concentrated down the Mississippi and create a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, larger than New Jersey. All of these things involve very, very, as I say, convoluted chains of events that are difficult to represent. Let me give another example of this. One of the things that I'll be talking about today is the elasticity of time, how time gets compressed and how it gets elongated in different circumstances, and the dramatic and emotional effects of elongating or compressing time. Now, after World War II, as many of you know, there was a sort of explosion in the chemical industry, in the plastics industry. And in the US, there was a lot of DDT stockpiled. And by the early 1950s, there was some concern, public concern being voiced that DDT was a risk, that it was toxic, and so forth. So one of the chemical companies had this commercial go up. And this is a woman in evident, robust good health who is literally in a cloud of DDT. They gave her a root beer and a hot dog and were proving that DDT could do no harm because, look, she's eating her lunch and she's safe and she's in this state of toxic transcendentalism of some kind. Okay. But this ongoing war about how time is dramatized, how it is compressed, how risk is circumscribed, is an endless issue, as I'm sure all of you are aware. So slow violence then is associated with what psychologists sometimes call cumulative trauma. Trauma where there is no trigger event, but incrementally it produces traumatic symptoms. But it can seem eventless, and it can seem without a source. Similarly, it's related to what Rachel Carson called death by indirection, this idea of ricochet death, oblique deaths, and whereby that obliqueness makes it harder to trace causes and assign culpability. And Carson had a little meditation on this question of death by indirection where she talks about the challenge of turning into image and narrative what she called the formlessness of death by indirection. Okay, so giving form to formlessness, which clearly is a legal issue and also an aesthetic issue. In other words, you're given a formless body of material and you're trying to shape it into a convincing narrative that involves all sorts of sub-narratives, which can be scientific, can be environmental justice, and can have to do with the form of law itself. So I thought one way of sort of dramatizing my ideas was by contrast with a book that has been very influential, Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. This came out a few months after Slow Violence, so I didn't actually have a chance to engage with it in the book. But it was an immediate bestseller and arguably has been the most influential book on thinking about violence since Michael Walz's Just and Unjust Wars. And one of the reasons I think the book has had such an impact is that it's a counterintuitive, feel-good story about violence. And what Pinker says his project is in the book is to track over the course of 5,000 years arithmetic trends in violence. Okay, it's a massively ambitious book with all sorts of methodological issues. But his conclusion, is that basically these are the best times to be living in, and that the better angels of our nature are in the ascendancy. And one of the surprising conclusions was that despite some glitches like Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, King Leopold at the beginning of the century, the Great Lakes Wars in the Congo at the end of the century, despite those glitches, that actually statistically, in terms of the human mean, the 20th century was not a violent century. Okay. So In the responses to the book, Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times had a laudatory piece called "Are We Getting Nicer?" HuffPost had "Is Violence Finished?" The Daily Beast had "Is Violence History?" American Scholar had a piece, "Getting Better All the Time." Okay, so it really had a good, feel-good charge to it. Crucially, as you can see from the cover, you have the image of Abraham and Isaac, okay, the knife at the throat. The focus in Pinker's book is on immediate kind of gory violence, and indeed the first couple of hundred pages are kind of exuberantly nasty, getting into boilings in vats of oil, witch burnings, pre-Enlightenment garrottings, beheadings, scalpings, crucifixions, and so forth, which he notes are pleasantly in decline. But what he doesn't deal with, the other thing is, what he doesn't really deal with in great detail are either the questions of empire or questions of technology. So to date, I mean, he talks a lot about, for instance, around the 12th century, the Mongol slaughters, and that period as the most violent in human history. But paleobiologists so far have not unearthed any evidence that the Mongol emperors were capable of intercontinental drone warfare. Okay? So the question of the technological outsourcing of violence is never really addressed. That the violence that is center stage in his book is hand-to-hand combat or close-range violence. And it seems to me, and it's something I try to address in my book, that we absolutely need to think of the technologies of distance in relation to globalization and the geographies of distance, and also the temporal distancing that accompanies that. So for instance, Pinker talks about the Cold War as the long peace. He renames it the long peace. And his reason for calling it the long peace is that the superpowers successfully avoided ever going to war. But what he doesn't discuss is the degree to which those superpowers were able to outsource their wars. So that if you were in Cambodia or Laos or Vietnam or Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Angola, Mozambique, Horn of Africa, or so forth, those were decidedly not the decades of the long peace. So part of my difference there is that in choosing a species narrative, he neglects this issue of disparity in violence locally as opposed to globally, and also neglects the technologies of displacement. And Doug in his post mentioned this going back to the 1920s and 30s when British bombers were bombing in Afghanistan and Iraq. There's some very powerful testimony from those early bombers talking about the emotional distance that they felt because of the technological distance that enabled them not to see what was happening. I think that is a really critical issue when we try to calibrate violence in these ways. And so my focus really is on the kind of bloodless bloodbaths that have been perpetuated through these technologies and through these processes of empire and globalization. And these processes clearly allow for a disowning of violence in various complex ways. And I felt that there had been a lot of work done in terms of geographical disowning of consequences, but less work done in terms of temporal disowning. And so in looking at the ways in advance and retrospect, the body counts tended to be conservative. I felt that this inbuilt mechanism whereby you could say, well, in 30 years' time, people won't remember that where the landmines in Cambodia came from, or what the radiation sickness's source was. Those structures of amnesia, particularly in an era where we have these very focused digital expectations of what an event looks like. That's very much a central component of this. So there's a contest really at the heart of the book between fully imagined time and unimagined time, and likewise between imagined communities and actively unimagined communities, what are called disposable people and disposable ecologies. And the entangled relations, as in that John Clare quote that I put up at the outset, the entangled relations between the fully imagined communities and these actively unimagined communities. So in thinking about Pinker's story of violence, I wondered what it would look like if he acknowledged the staggered violence of these deferred deaths, as does Colonel James Norton, a US colonel, who was quite blunt about the effects of depleted uranium weaponry, which has a radioactive life of 4.51 billion years. So these are Norton's words. "We feel we have to use depleted uranium. It's radioactive, I wish it wasn't, but I can't change the laws of physics. The issue is, once you've had a hit, once you're involved in the catastrophic failure of the tank, did the crew survive long enough to really care whether it was tungsten, which is a non-toxic substitute, or depleted uranium that hit them? Anyone who does should count themselves damn lucky. I'm sure every one of them would thank God that they lived 40 years to contract lymphoma." Okay. So here he's talking specifically about US troops, but obviously it has implications for the landscapes of peril in those war zones. And as is typically the case, but with unusual bluntness here, he describes how immediate violence trumps the violence of deferred effects. And I think this has profound consequences for the issues of legal preemption and legal compensation that Dayna lays out in her essay. And so I think this is Pinker's work is a useful segue into Dayna Scott's reflections on subjecthood and slow violence in her essay, in her blog post, and also in her larger work on toxicity and Sarnia, Ontario. And as I read it, she's calling for a more rigorous materialist feminist perspective on the relationship between discounted casualties and discredited knowledge, discounted casualties and discredited knowledge. In other words, discounted or discredited knowledge costs lives. Another way of putting this is under neoliberal regimes, including legal regimes, whose knowing counts, and what regimes of knowledge position some knowers as expert, as monadic experts, and other communities as discredited for reasons of gender, class, race, or whatever. And so a critical term here is the idea of bearing witness in a legal sense, in an imaginative sense, in the way that I'm talking about in the book, but also bearing witness in the body, in other words, the embodied load of toxicity as well, and what is the status of that body in the legal process. And I thought I'd allude to a case of that with one of the, sorry, this is missing a slide. Okay, forget it. In the case of Animals, People, which is a novel about the Bhopal disaster, and it's set significantly 20 years after the disaster, so it's about the largely forgotten after effects. But Animal himself goes on all fours, and he was born just at the time of the disaster and was mocked for being four-legged, and so he took upon himself the language of the mockery and calls himself animal, and pushes against the idea that he's human because he's so disillusioned with humanity because of the Bhopal disaster. Okay, but there's a moment in the very in the very protracted trials around animals, the Bhopal case, where the judge asks him to take the stand, and he does, but because he's a horizontal human, not a vertical human, he's not visible to the judge. So the judge says, stand up, and he says, I am standing. But he comes in his person and in his invisibility to embody discredited knowledge. And I think it's a very powerful courtroom scene there, that he is before the law, but he's also beneath the law. And that is physically dramatized in that scene, that because of his class and his disability, he's literally a lowlife in the eye of the court. A similar related issue takes us back to John Clare, this great British poet of the enclosures, where at one point after he was moved out of his Northampton rural residence through enclosures, he says, I was moved out of my knowledge. I was moved out of my knowledge. And one of the legal questions that arises, and that Dayna addresses in her writing, is what is the status and what is the stature of immersed knowledge, knowledge that is grounded in experiential community as opposed to hierarchical, monadic, expert knowledge. And in the case of John Clare, he was institutionalized as insane, and there's no question that a component of that derangement was being unsettled in his knowledge, that he was in some sense mutilated by that displacement. And as I discuss in the book, there's both the physical displacement of being evicted and losing those connections to people and environment, but there's also displacement in place, and I think Dayna writes very powerfully about this as well. What happens when you remain in place, but the place incrementally loses the very characteristics that made it inhabitable and that enabled it to sustain life. So that's a different kind of displacement, and I think in the post from Tasmania, we had that as well. What is the impact of when law doesn't just trammel on rights, but trammels on place, on the very idea of place itself? So I think one of the uptakes from this materialist feminist tradition is how identity involves a porous, multi-directional set of relationships between body and environment. As Dayna mentions, Stacey Alamo in particular talks about these relationships as transcorporeal, among bodies, transcending bodies. And Donna Haraway reminds us that biologically speaking, partners never precede their relationship. Partners never precede their relationship, which is a very powerful pushback against the often common assumptions, because neoliberalism has been around so long, that the monadic individual is the originary unit of society and the law. Margaret Thatcher famously said, there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals and families. That's the sort of quintessential statement in this ground. Okay. So as Greg Mittman, the historian of science, has also said, in line with Donna Haraway, the biological is social all the way down. The biological is social all the way down. Symbiosis, once thought to be an aberration of biology, is turning out to be more the rule than the exception. So I think this tradition of transcorporeal porous identity is very much in keeping with this sort of ascendant awareness in biological circles of the power and pervasiveness of symbiosis. So how does all this relate to slow violence? I think a critical term here is distance, the imposition of knowledge that is geographically distant and hierarchical, knowledge imposed from above and from afar. Arundhati Roy, for one, writes really brilliantly about this in just the very character of the discourse that creates distance and makes it very difficult for the kind of immersed corporeal knowledge to articulate itself to those abstracted, removed, discursive structures. And I was talking to Pooja last night about splicing together or setting up in counterpoint within one narrative radically different voices in order not to have that hegemonic discursive pressure to absorb very different types of language into this one commanding and often very abstracted language. So this experiential knowledge is central to the social movements that I discuss. And this is Wangari Maathai, the Greenbelt movement in Kenya. They planted 100 million trees. And here she is trying to sort of articulate a very different position on all of this. And she's talking about the violence of deforestation and monoculture. During the rainy season, she says, thousands of tons of topsoil are eroded from Kenya's countryside by rivers and washed into the ocean and lakes. Additionally, soil is lost through wind erosion in areas where the land is devoid of vegetative cover. Losing topsoil should be considered analogous to losing territory to an invading enemy. And indeed, if any country were so threatened, it would mobilize all available resources, including a heavily armed military, to protect the priceless land. Unfortunately, the loss of soil through these elements has yet to be perceived with such urgency. Okay? So in an authoritarian context in Kenya, there was appropriation of land, and monoculture was also impacting the levels of deforestation and the declining levels of stewardship of the soil. And so she was trying to enfold this embodied knowledge that rural Kenyan women had of the agricultural conditions of life into an idea of national security. And it's interesting, when Maathai and the Greenbelt movement were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2005, there were a number of prominent people who objected to that and said, she's not really dealing with war. There are these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. How can she get a peace prize? And the idea of preemptive peace on an environmental justice front around soil conservation was too radical an extension of the idea of war and peace for many people. So I wanted to talk briefly about the politics of visibility, about vanishing acts, both in terms of events and then vanishing acts, obviously, in a legal sense. I was listening recently to an unnamed Peruvian environmental activist on the BBC World Service, and he was talking about illegal deforestation in Peru by paramilitary goons. And in the process of these assaults, a number of these indigenous activists were killed. And he said something that really startled me, which was, those people were dead to the eye before they were killed. Those people were dead to the eye before they were killed. In other words, they were the kind of targets that could be eliminated because they didn't have the status of visibility. Okay? And that is very much in keeping with this whole idea of unimaginative community, the relationship between imaginative failures and vulnerability. Sometimes we have struggles that have very successfully mobilized to render themselves visible. And this is an indigenous struggle that took place at the end of last year in Bolivia, which is something like 60% indigenous. And what was proposed was a road through the Amazonian lowlands that cut through a variety of tribal lands, and was resisted by the groups. It was a Brazilian road that was going to be contracted by the Bolivian government. And these groups objected that there would be biodiversity loss, colonists would be brought in, there would be the transgression of sacred lands, and on all of these fronts they really objected to the road. And so what they undertook was a kind of performance art, which was a march from the lowlands up to 13,000 foot to La Paz, to the capital. And the march is something like 600 kilometers, took them 2 months. And they literally drummed up support. So they had these marching bands, and indigenous peoples all along the route joined them. And by the time they got to La Paz, there was so much pressure on Evo Morales, who had built his reputation on the idea of being pro-indigenous, that the road was actually cancelled. So in this case, what might have been an invisible threat was opposed by elongating time, through this processional resistance, creating a kind of performance theatre that allowed for media coverage and allowed for public debate. What is, I think, more typical is the compression of time, and this is particularly evident in something like climate change, where you're trying to dramatize a process. And I wanted to just show this is a group called 1010 that was trying to reduce emissions in Britain.
Right, kids, just before you go, there's a brilliant idea in the air that I'd like to run by you. Now, it's called 10-10. The idea is everyone starts cutting their carbon emissions by 10%, thus keeping the planet safe for everyone, eventually. Now, this hasn't got to be a huge thing, but I would love it if you and your families would think about doing something.
What sort of thing, miss?
Well, like getting your dad to insulate the loft, or taking your next holiday by train instead of flying, or buying energy-saving light bulbs.
We're thinking of using our car less. I'm going to cycle to school.
That's fantastic, Jemima. Now, no pressure at all, but it'd be great to get a sense of how many of you might do this. Just a rough percentage. That's fantastic! And those not? Philip and Tracy. That's fine, that's absolutely fine. Your own choice. Okay, class, thank you so much for today, and I will see you all tomorrow. Oh, just before you go, I just need to press this little button here. Now, everybody, please remember to read chapters 5 and 6 on volcanoes and glaciation. Except for Philip and Tracy, of course.
Right, just want to check on that 10-10 thing. Had some brilliant ideas from lots of you, how the firm can cut down emissions by 10%. Just quick show of hands, everyone who wants to get involved. Great, that's nearly everybody. And, yeah, just for the record, no pressure. Those who aren't quite convinced about it yet? Cool, it's no problem. Your choice. Okay, so those of you planning something here or at home should probably get working on it. Oh, gorgeous. Those of you who aren't... Excellent. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Well, hello everyone. It's great to be back here.
In case there are any Tottenham Hotspurs fans, there's another, they lose a few players as well. So you can see it's sort of a dazzlingly incompetent attempt to compress time, and it's not like I think people are going to see this and say, oh, I saw that really scary video, I'm going to go and insulate the loft. So it was pulled very quickly. I think they realized that it was giving ecofascism a bad name. But it, if nothing else, it dramatizes the the challenges in this crude way of turning something like climate change into something visceral and immediate and literally explosive.
Except the people who blew up were the ones who didn't do it, right?
Yeah. So
Not exactly how we might dramatize it. It should have been the other people blowing up.
right, but it was a if you don't cooperate, you're dead. Yeah. So yeah. I'm just going to end with one last example of this attempt, which some of you may be familiar with from the movie The Island President. This is Mohammed Nasheed, the Maldivian president, and the Maldives is sort of in the front line of the climate crisis. The highest point in the Maldives is like 7 feet, and there are 350,000 people. It's right in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and it's a nation that is largely invisible on the world stage, has contributed almost nothing to carbon emissions. But just ahead of the Copenhagen Climate Summit, Mohammed Nasheed and his cabinet held this cabinet meeting, a subaqueous theater of kind, as a kind of staging of a preview of the aftermath. It's a kind of premonitory theater. We go first, you go later, and so in the scene, he's signing into law a commitment to being carbon neutral in 10 years. Okay, and so I think the question of tone here is important. An attempt to both create something memorable, but not something pious. There's a humorous theatricality to the urgency. And there's another scene where they plant the Maldivian flag on the sea floor, and we typically associate flags with ascent and summits. And so there was a climate summit and the inverted ascent to the sea floor of the nation. And it was picked up by 350.org. It was kind of synchronized, and so it did have an enormous amount of play. One of the things that strikes me about this image is that it's an image of reverse inundation. If we think of the language of human movement, migration, very often the movement of brown and black people to rich white countries has been described in terms of inundation, submerging, drowning. And so here what we have is an inversion of that, where it's poor brown people facing down the threat of having their national territory swamped by a 200-plus year experiment in carbon extraction and use, consumption, that the beneficiaries of whom have largely been in the white rich countries. This is just an example of that language from Great Gatsby. Tom Buchanan: civilization's going to pieces. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard? The idea is, if we don't look out for the white race, we'll be utterly submerged. Okay. As it happens, and I just want to close with this thought. Last week I was at a conference with a legal studies scholar, Maxine Burkett, and we were both talking at this, and we both happened to start with the same image of inundation in the Maldives. And her talk was called Climate-Induced Migration and the Challenge of Statehood. And it was very illuminating for me as a non-legal studies scholar to follow her reasoning and to look at the ways that she was using this particular example to help codify a legal framework in advance that would protect climate refugees. Otherwise, as you correctly noted, we could expect climate-induced mass migration and a chaotic international situation flowing from that. She quotes David King to the effect that the maps of the world will have to be redrawn to accommodate these climate-induced migrants, a very ambitious project. And Burkett's operative categories are predecessor states and successor states. In other words, there are nation states whose territory will disappear entirely, and they will have to move to successor states. So there's a question of what happens when certain territories disappear under the waves and others must accommodate the stateless. And crucially, for her argument, she's talking not about stateless individuals, but only nation states in their entireties. And that's why she focuses on the island states. And this idea of collective vanishing. So for instance, in Bangladesh, numerically, you're actually going to have more climate refugees or climate-induced migrants sooner than you are from the island states. But because some of Bangladesh's territory will remain viable, she's not looking at those particular examples. But from an imaginative point, one of the issues that arose for me was what constitutes vanishing. Because in these island states, they are becoming uninhabitable through salination, through exposure to wave action, before they're actually vanishing. So agriculture and the water table and so forth are being polluted by salination. So what you get from the compressed image of Mohammed Nasheed on the seafloor is some kind of visual expectation of total disappearance. But there's going to be some tipping point where you can still see some of the landmass of the islands, but nobody can live there, okay? And so for me, one of the things that interested me about this process as she projects it is the relationship between the visual triggers of vanishing and the fact that vanishing actually takes place only after a period of uninhabitability, in a sense, okay? So what is the legal consequence of having a nation state that is no longer territorially viable, but is still as yet undrowned? Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, so for me, there's many points of connection, and I won't be able to address all of them that I find useful in my own work, but I'm going to cover three themes in response. One is material transgressions and intergenerational time. Just remember that the second one is knowing slow violence, and Rob talked a little bit about that. And then the third theme, resisting unimagining and resisting catastrophism. So I'm going to begin by scaling down. And I'm doing this because I expect that in the next panels in the afternoon, we'll have a chance to talk in broader terms about law and development, about political dynamics, about North and South. So we'll go from the level of the individual up to political communities, states, nations, and I thought I would start by going from the level of the individual down into particular bodies, organs, tissues, cells, and signals. So I'm talking about the invisible transgressions that enact slow violence over time and between generations. Toxicity, I got started thinking, is like a good ecological citizen, right? It thinks globally, acts locally. It acts on cellular receptors, molecularly. And through this book, I think we become cognizant of both this sort of intimate cellular violence and its sometimes distant or transnational origins. So we're asked to confront both the sort of chronic everyday exposures that sicken the downwinders, right? Those that are stuck in the plumes of the world's industrial clusters, and to consider the acute exposures that can decimate either quickly or slowly whole populations, sometimes in the wake of an industrial explosion, a nuclear disaster, or precision warfare. And I think what's really nice is that Nixon opens this window up for us, and where we get to consider biological citizenship as forged in relation to contamination. So where affected citizens have to engage in this battle with the state in order to gain recognition and admittance into this state created category of sufferers, right? And in law, we're quite familiar with this process, right? The administration of the difference between those who can gain recognition as sufferers and those who are dismissed as non-sufferers, usually because their narrative of the injury doesn't meet our standards of causation. We know that the failure to articulate the right story then translates into a failure to achieve the remedy. And Adriana Petrina writes about this in relation to post-Chernobyl Ukraine. Here she says the psychosocial becomes entangled with the somatic, right? The person's experience of their body and its symptoms sometimes becomes what the legal categories need it to be. And I think this is demonstrated very well in the book. It's the way our rules are penetrating outwards into social relations, not only because the people, our rules influence how the people experience their bodies and the material conditions of living that will flow from the category they're able to achieve, but also because the rules over time shape how those bodies are materially constituted. And I think this can happen in at least two ways. The first way is that the contours of the regime of compensation that follow the environmental or the industrial disaster determines the ability of the culpable actor to absorb it, right? And then it ultimately shapes the prospects of its repeat, constituting bodies into the future. And I think Anne McClintock's essay on the BP spill is a great example of that dynamic. But the other way, and I don't think we need to confine ourselves to these dramatic one-off events to make this claim, I think it can also be true that the chronic low-dose exposures associated with whether you're living in a pollution hotspot, an export processing zone, or downstream of some major extractive site, those types of exposures can also be construed as constituting bodies into the future. So, as an example, I wanted to talk about my work with the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, which is downwind of Sarnia's Chemical Valley, and just specifically to take the example of endocrine disrupting pollution. So lots of you know I've grappled for a long time with how we could actually get law to conceive of the endocrine disruption as an injury or a harm. And for those of you who don't know, quickly, endocrine disruptors, the gender benders, are synthetic chemicals that share structural features with the common sex hormones. So they're discharged into the air around Sarnia as a byproduct in the petrochemical manufacturing that's taking place there. And their mode of action in the body is to mimic hormones, right? They're trying to trick cellular receptors into thinking that they are, in most cases, estrogens. So because hormones are able to travel in the blood in such low concentrations, it's believed that very slight gradations in the level of these substances in bodies can have a dramatic effect, certainly at certain key times of development and reproduction. So in other words, the endocrine disruption theory is putting the old toxicological canon on its head. It's no longer necessarily true that the dose makes the poison. In Aamjiwnaang, the story began as many of the environmental justice struggles do, right? It's with an exercise in popular epidemiology. So this is a form of political struggle where people, residents themselves, decide to collect the data that can prove their experience of the contamination. And the results of that confirmed what many people there suspected for years, and that was that the community's sex ratio, this is the number of boy babies born relative to the number of girl babies, was declining at an alarming rate. And so there was a research partnership, there was a study published in Environmental Health Perspectives, which is a prestigious journal, and the band itself was left to deal with this sort of unwelcome distinction of the world's lowest documented sex ratio. And in fact, the study fit into this scientific picture that was being pieced together around the Great Lakes, where researchers had found sex ratio changes in bird, turtle, and fish populations, and all thought to be tied to exposures to endocrine disrupting chemicals. That's the backstory, and I want you now to consider the role of law, right? So the effect of the endocrine disrupting pollution in this case is not only gendered in the typical environmental justice way, that is affecting women and girls differently than men and boys, but it's potentially gendering. It seems to be responsible for producing more girls than boys. And the hypothesis with the most traction in the scientific community was that the chemical milieu inside the mother's body was resulting in a disproportionate loss of male embryos in early miscarriage, usually before the woman even became aware that she was pregnant. So when we dig down, we discover law's ambivalence to this pollution, right? So weak federal action taken after an international convention banned the manufacture of many of these substances and urged us to try to eliminate them from the unintentional release during production processes. The provinces continuing to issue pollution permits that would inevitably increase the discharge of these contaminants. The provinces backtracking on an cumulative effects regulation that would, in response to pressure from the Chemical Industries Association, and the chemical industry's toothless and self-serving codes of conduct. If we consider this, it's obvious that law and the regulation governing pollution here in Amjanong is implicated in the material constitution of bodies, right? It's shaping their form over time. So it's a demonstration of how our rules are reaching outwards into social relations and constituting bodies into the future. Second topic I wanted to talk about is knowing slow violence. We know that these types of pollution harms are material, that they have generational effects. What it's very difficult for people to know in many cases is whether the afflictions we're experiencing today, so cancer, reproductive problems, developmental difficulties, are caused by presently occurring pollution or are manifestations of exposures that are long past. And so, as Nixon says, there's indeed a problem of disconnect. The consequences are concealed by the slow passage of delayed effects. But I'm starting to wonder if that's all that's concealing them. What if is that all that's preventing us from knowing them, right? It might also be that they're concealed by a complex mechanism, right? In other words, it's not just a visibility problem, but it's an epistemological problem. So the idea that the synthetic chemicals in our bodies exhibit, in Nixon's words, embodied ongoing percolations beyond our own lives, I think adds a layer of complication to the way we as law scholars typically approach the problem of delayed effects. So I wanted to give a couple of examples. One is with respect to a current biomonitoring program in Canada. So scientists and policymakers now concede that in utero exposures can have a big impact on a person's disease burden later in life. But we want to consider the type of study we would have to do in order to actually understand that dynamic, right? So we would need to know if we wanted to figure out, for example, if in utero exposures to certain types of chemicals were associated with Alzheimer's, we would need a study that would identify potential culprits, would monitor pregnant women's exposures now, and then would follow the health status of those infants as they go through their life, right? So maybe for 80 years. So we get these splashy announcements of biomonitoring studies, and that tell us they're going to help us figure out which exposures are benign and which are dangerous. But we need to understand that those types of studies aren't even going to begin to give us any useful information for 50, 60, maybe more years. So we would have to be, if we wanted to rely on that type of knowing, comfortable with the fact that we would keep the exposures in the status quo for the next 50 years or more before we would start to learn whether or not they're harming us. And by the way, in Canada, the study is called the Maternal Infant Research on Environmental Chemicals, MIREC. It was announced in 2006 when the federal government was in minority, was trying to prove that it was tough on toxics, right? Basically a smokescreen for the no climate change policy. And a big splashy announcement, and then 5 years later we're fighting them, or fighting Health Canada to continue funding this study. 5 years, right? And so we may pour millions into a study that will give us clues about these things 50 years down the road, but we might abandon it after only 10 or 15 when we really know nothing. And furthermore, I think biomonitoring is a risky proposition for disproportionately affected communities because there's always a possibility that even with the data, we'll fall short of the legal threshold of causation. And so just another quick example, also drawn from the federal toxics management scene. And that's with respect to BPA. So this is the chemical that makes hard plastic, clear plastic hard. And we had in Canada, as many of you will know, a declaration of toxicity for BPA, and we were the first jurisdiction to do so, and that was in 2010, I think. So what did we have? We had some exposure data, right? We knew this chemical was leaching out of plastics and into food and water. We had good biomonitoring data. We knew that it was found in the urine of up to 90% of us. We had good health effect evidence. We knew that people with higher exposures experienced the expected adverse health outcomes, i.e. those that were predicted by toxicology and animal studies, at higher rates than those with lower exposures. Was this good enough to meet our regulatory standard? The industry made one last gasp, right? It was unsuccessful, but they made one last gasp, and it was, but you have not proven causation, right? You have no proof that it's taken up in tissues. Actually, the fact that we find it in urine means it's probably not affecting us at all, the producers of these poisons said. Quote, it's just running right through us. And this resonated with me for I was reading Nixon's book about the politics of permeation and duration, right? He says, the industrial particulates and effluents that live on in the environmental elements we inhabit and in our very bodies are, quote, epidemiologically and ecologically never our simple contemporaries. And so it brings to mind the body of literature that Rob was discussing in feminist theory of the body, and particularly Stacey Alamo's notion of transcorporeality. And I was stopped because in the volume Material Feminisms, I encountered the same phrase, right? And emanating from such a different place. And what these feminists say is that chemicals in the environment are, quote, running right through us in endless waves. And they're positing essentially that the body and the environment are continuous, right? That as living beings, we're tracing our existence, not only, they say, to a specific maternal body, but to a chain of bodies, a genealogical and maternal element. We are the accumulation and concretion of our history, of what has happened to us and our people. In other words, our own pasts, the pasts of our parents, the material conditions of those places in which that whole chain of bodies lived, worked, and played is carried forward in each of us as constituent bits, rearranged and reconfigured. So conceptually, what they're providing for us is a mechanism for how the past remains persistently in the present, and how, as Nixon says, the past is never past. And further, what I think these feminists do, and we won't have time to discuss this right now, is they provide a potent challenge to the individual as the basic unit of analysis, right? Which, as Nixon notes, has been a central, blinkered insistence of Western liberal theory and legal thought. So my third topic, resisting unimagining and resisting catastrophism. So I've argued that I think law functions to underestimate in advance and in retrospect the human and environmental costs of slow violence, and specifically law provides the principles, institutions, and mechanisms by which we ensure the systematic underestimation of those costs. And I've said in the review that for accomplishing it in advance, we employ mechanisms of environmental impact assessments or risk assessments. And I wanted to use a quick example today with respect to a federal infrastructure project, where I guess I have to also give the caveat that in Canada we used to use a tool called environmental risk assessment, and those are now streamlined. So this is an ongoing struggle, right? The environmental justice resistance to the pipeline projects that are proposed. This is on Danang. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the active unimagining of communities that are downstream. And I think we're seeing that in Canada right now with respect to both the extractive sites and the tar sands, and also with respect to the communities downstream of the refining that will process the dirty crude. So for the point of illustrating today, I'll talk specifically about Enbridge's Line 9 proposal. And this is the one that where they want to reverse the flow of oil between Sarnia and Montreal. The principal advantage of the Line 9 reversal, according to its proponents, of course, is that most of the pipe is already in place. It just needs to be repurposed to allow the tar sands crude to be brought all the way to Quebec, where it could either link up with the Portland-Montreal pipeline to hit Tidewater, or with the addition of another pipeline to St. John, they could reach the big Irving refinery there. And the first hurdle for this pipeline was cleared last July. The NEB gave approval to re-reverse the flow of Line 9 between Sarnia and Montreal. So I should tell you, initially when Enbridge built the main line, oil traveled from Sarnia towards Montreal, and then in the early 1990s, when the imported light crudes became more economical for the refineries in Sarnia, it was changed direction. The proposal now is to reverse the direction of Line 9. And the application on this initial phase 1 part was opposed by the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, who feared that the heavier western crudes would lead to more deadly air emissions from the refineries that circle their reserve. It was also opposed by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who fear that a spill of diluted bitumen from the pipeline on their traditional territories would poison sacred lands and waters. So what did the NEB decide? The NEB had a mandate to assess both the biophysical elements like air and water quality, fish habitat, as well as socioeconomic effects like traditional land use or human health impacts. Notwithstanding the fact that it was faced with 18 registered interveners, crowds of Six Nations activists and their supporters that were ejected from the hearings, and the claim by many mainstream NGOs and interveners that the plan would dramatically change the way oil moves across and is processed in our country, the panel characterized the project it was assessing as, quote, infrastructure additions and modifications related to pumps, piping, and valves at 4 existing fenced and graveled sites along Line 9. So this was despite an affidavit that was filed by the chief of Aamjiwnaang First Nation saying that changing the type of oil that was processed in those refineries would add to the toxic load of air emissions around the reserve, that affidavit itself was based on Enbridge's own filings about how the crude coming through the pipeline would change and the total supply of tar sands crude would change. The predicted effect, according to the NEB, was that basically it was reduced to sort of tallying up the emissions that would come from a few valves and fittings when they changed the direction on the pipe. So to me, there's an explicit refusal to address the sort of broader upstream and downstream effects of the pipeline, and I see it as a concrete example of what Nixon terms indirect violence, right? It's unimagining through the bloodless, technocratic, and pseudo-neutral voice of law. And finally, I just want to tie this in with what Nixon calls the crisis of futurity. And I've been thinking a little bit about his phrase, the extractivist ideology of time, using the example of the invocation of intergenerational equity concerns by Indigenous opposition to the pipelines in the recent Idle No More actions. This was one of the Idle No More demonstrations in Sarnia as well. So, pipelines, we have to think of them as big, concrete, fixed infrastructure projects. They're enduring and they have lasting consequences for people in particular places over time. And in that way, we have to think about the pipelines also as retrenching our infrastructure of fossil capitalism, right? Committing us to the continued extraction in the tar sands far into the future. And we've heard the language of intergenerational equity come out in a lot of the resistance by Indigenous people. So just a couple of examples. Ariel Duranje of the Athabascan Chippewayan First Nation states, quote, "We are taking steps to slow down development in northern Alberta in order to ensure our rights and lands are protected now and into the future." The Yinka Dene Alliance, which includes a number of First Nations across northern BC who have banned the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline from their territories, declare that they're acting in accordance with responsibilities to themselves, their ancestors, and their descendants, and state that they will, quote, "not tolerate this great threat to all future generations." So these are kinds of statements that stand in direct contradiction to this extractivist ideology of time, in which the official oil sands propaganda involves cheery predictions about land reclamation. And I think that the communities that find themselves superfluous to the narrative of progress and national development, to the responsible resource development agenda, they're engaging in active resistance, whether it's under the ban of Idle No More or not, and that the resistance is likely to intensify. What I want to do is try to find a way to articulate and honor this resistance without resorting to an apocalyptic scenario, right? Without saying we must hear these voices now or be prepared to face the chaos and consequences later. And I want to be able to honor it in terms of its imaginative potential rather than its consequences and inconveniences for settlers. So this brings me to the one place where I'm going to diverge a little bit or try to challenge Rob and take up some discussion time for us, hopefully. And that is that Rob ends his talk and his book, in a sense, with an appeal that seems to want to motivate action on the basis of predicted bad consequences for everyone, right? So in this, there's a subtitle in the book, "We're all downwinders now, some sooner than others." And I think Rob joins many other scholars going down this road, and he does it more thoughtfully than most. And a lot of these people's work I hold in highest regard and whose aims I embrace into a common project. But so Nixon treats as illusory the assumption that addressing the causes of slow violence can be infinitely deferred. In other words, he argues that the burden in the present may fall on them, but ultimately it will get to us too. And I want us to think a little bit harder about whether we need that move, right? Is that part necessary to making slow violence visible? So there's a couple of places in the book, and climate change is where almost every author succumbs to this, I think, right? Because it's such the classic example. Quote, "Over time, the risk will be passed on as today's imperiled islanders turn into climate refugees whose desperation will eventually reach into the richer high-consumption nations who triggered it in the first place." And later, he states, "Slow violence will drown the Maldives first, but unchecked will ultimately breach the walls that concretize," right? And it goes on. But we all know that those disproportionately burdened don't just happen to live downwind in space or time, right? And the book makes this abundantly clear. And that's actually the point I was trying to make about the video, which I'm not sure what to make of that video you showed yet, but the point I was trying to make is that if it is about time, right? If it is about saying what they've done is they've compressed the consequences in time and showed it to us, there is no relationship between the people who will suffer that consequences and whether or not you choose to take action, right? And in fact, we know that there's probably a really unrandom, but not predictable in the way they predicted it, distribution to the way the consequences will play out, right? So the casualties aren't those who refuse to be the good ecological citizens, right? That's my problem with the video, but anyway.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems.
Yeah, there are. Okay, so the basic point I'm just trying to end on is, do we have to turn to these images of the poor black and brown bodies turning up on our shores to motivate readers? Do we have to go that final step? Is that an element of making slow violence visible, and is it one that that we gain more from than we lose from it? Because I want to explore whether it is enough for us to simply say the consequences are unfair and they're not just and not have to add, and they're going to inundate all of us eventually. Thank you.
Thanks.